call centre. And this is the Wednesday webinar, perhaps we should call it, Coal with Your Coffee. Today I'm going to give an overview of, well, a shortened version of a plenary I gave at the International Conference on Mercury as a Global Pollutant last week in Krakow in Poland. So it's going to be a mix of information on mercury control that I have covered before, but along with a wider question of why coal is still being used in power and industry. And this is a bit of a taster for my current draft of Coal in the Energy Trilemma, which will come as a full webinar hopefully later this year. So today I'm going to try and answer 3 of these questions. Where's the mercury coming from? Why are we still using coal? And how can we reduce emissions? So firstly, where's the mercury coming from? Now, this is a diagram from the Global Mercury Assessment the GMA has produced by the UN Environment Programme. If you want to download the GMA, it's available as it's almost like a coffee table book. It's a beautiful picture book with lots of diagrams summarising the global situation on mercury. And diagrams such as this, which summarises emissions from around the world of all mercury from all sources. And as we can see, emissions are coming largely from Asia, South America, and Africa, because these are the countries where there is most economic and population growth. And this is data, as I said, for all emissions of mercury, not just from coal. If we break it down into each of these regions, South and Southeast Asia, South America, and so on, we can see what are the sources in these individual regions. And the colour that's catching your eye most is probably that golden yellow colour, and that is the ASGM, the artisanal and small-scale gold mining. And that is appropriate because this is the gold sector. This is individual miners using raw liquid mercury in their hands to collect and mine gold by hand. It's the largest source of mercury worldwide, and because ASGM is illegal, it's hard to get real data on the scale of this issue. But it is estimated that there are still 10 to 15 million people, many women and children, still mining for gold with mercury with their hands. The darker orange colour is intentional use. That's light switches and batteries and so on, which is being dealt with under waste and use management. In light blue, we have industry, which will include chlor-alkali and vinyl production, which are being phased out, but also metal and cement production, which I'll talk about a bit at the end of this talk. And that final dark blue chunk, that is the emissions from stationary coal combustion, power and heat, and that's what we're going to focus on today. But before we do, we're going to ask ourselves, why are we still using coal in the energy mix? Well, demand for energy and electricity is still increasing. There are, between 7 and 8 billion of us on the planet, and 1 billion of us or more still don't have access to electricity. Moving these people onto the grid will obviously mean a significant increase in our baseload energy requirements. And this is not demand due to population growth. This is simply getting electricity to everyone who is already here. Similarly, bringing schools, hospitals, stores, industries in line for these emerging regions, that's all going to increase electricity demand. And then consider those that are moving from traditional cooking fuels. They're using biomass, animal waste, and so on to cook. These are going to be moving onto the grid, whether it be to gas or electrical cooking. And that's 2.8 billion people moving onto the grid for this new need that needs to be cleaned. And it's not just the emerging regions which are increasing demand for baseload. Consider the example of electric vehicles. If Europe advances to the point where 80% of us have electric vehicles, which is the aim for 2050, then that adds a whole new electricity demand to the grid in our region. That's a whole UK, United Kingdom's worth of power that has to come from somewhere. So let's step back and look at the energy trilemma. What people are looking at mainly is that top right-hand corner. The top corner, the environment and climate change, beg my pardon. Whereas the biggest pool is that bottom right-hand corner, the security of energy supply. People want a secure energy supply, not just so that the Wi-Fi always works, but to keep schools and hospitals and infrastructure working. It's almost like it's one of the basic human rights, access to electricity. And this means having excess capacity, because nationalities and economies have to cover any potential loss in power from any sector at one time. It also means having a diverse energy mix, not being too reliant on any one option. because blackouts and brownout events can cost billions of pounds worth of damages to a local or national economy. And so governments are going to ensure that they have a strong baseload of reliable and stable dispatchable power. But of course, down to the left there, they also want to keep that power affordable for everyone, not just the rich. And so governments must ensure that they have a strong baseload of power which is affordable. And coal, as I'll show you in a minute, is a very affordable option. But then, of course, we're drawn to that top triangle, the environment. This is where we claim to be putting most of our focus, but it can be a challenge to make it our focus because environmentally friendly power can cost a lot of money, and it tends not to be as reliable or secure as other more affordable options. So how countries balance this energy trilemma is very variable, and it depends on their outlook. If, for example, we look at, this is the World Energy Outlook, I've produced this amazing graph of the perception of the energy issue in different regions of the world. On the left there we have the OECD, that's the Western economies, and on the right the non-OECD, the more emerging regions. Now the x-axis along the bottom there, that's the impact of each of these individual concerns as they're perceived. And on the y-axis we have the uncertainty, how much we can evaluate the potential for this to be an effect on the energy trilemma. And then the size of the bubble is the urgency. So obviously it's a very complicated graph. I don't pretend it isn't. And it is included in the new report, so you can look after it at your leisure. But what I want to draw your eyes is the colours there. The green dots relate to the environmental concerns. So, for example, on the left there, our emerged economies, Western economies, we're more focused on the renewable energies, the green stuff. The blue relates to energy equity. So for us, most of us find energy affordable and are perhaps a little bit worried about the electricity prices. And the red, that is the energy security part. And for us, probably the most risky ones, as far as we are concerned, are things like cyber threats and digitalization. These are sort of advanced concerns. Whereas if you look in the right-hand graph there, we have these emerging economies. Yes, they do have green agenda on their mix, but they are most worried about economic growth, and they're most worried about the electricity and the affordability of that electricity. So it's just a good look at how different economies look at the energy trilemma. And if we get down to the nitty-gritty of the affordability of coal, if we look at the levelized cost of electricity for different sources, such as coal supercritical, lignite supercritical, gas turbine or open cycle turbine, down to nuclear, wind and offshore, then the ranges are quite similar. But coal and lignite are down there much more affordable than wind, offshore and onshore. The ranges are bigger for wind and solar because their success depends very much where they are and how well they're going to work in that environment. Yes, batteries would offset that issue. If and when we get batteries working, then the dispatchability and the reliability of wind and solar will disappear because we'll be able to capture that energy and use it when we need it. Unfortunately, battery power is extremely expensive and will be for a number of years yet. And there's also the concern of the metals and the other materials used in these batteries. There are flywheel and there are hydro-type methods for storing power as well. But again, the availability and the affordability of these depends on the region. And when you look at the baseline, coal is affordable. Now, the price for solar and wind is coming down, and it will come down over the next couple of decades. But if you look on the right hand of this graph here, you can see that coal is already affordable and it's going to remain affordable. So if you are an emerging economy coming online, trying to get power to your existing and expanding population, you're obviously going to be drawn to something that is affordable, reliable, and can be, if done properly, clean. So as I say, it's going to be the fuel of choice for emerging economies in Asia for years to come yet. Can we phase out coal if we wanted to? Well, in the Western economy, we're certainly trying to do that. This is a graph from Sandbag, an NGO, which has basically summarised what different regions in Europe are doing with respect to phasing out coal. So we see the countries in green, such as the UK and France and most of Scandinavia, have dates for phasing out coal, which are within the next decade or so. I believe Germany is working on somewhere between 20 and now in 2038. With a faster rollout for the larger, dirtier plants. But we also have regions within Europe, in the pink there, that have no phase-out date under discussion as yet. And in the broader terms, let's look at countries keeping coal in their national determined contributions. These are the heart of the Paris Agreement. These are the long-term goals for each country to reduce national emission standards, national emissions, and to adapt to the impact of climate change. And many of these countries are keeping coal as part of that strategy. So we have some divestment from coal. We have countries and companies and institutions and banks pulling back from financing coal. For example, the World Bank will only invest in new coal projects if under rare circumstances, and I don't believe they've done so for a number of years. There's a potential for a kind of kickback against that, which could be bad news. For example, if I'm an emerging economy looking to fund a new coal plant, in the past I would have gone to the World Bank. They would have said, yes, you can have funding. However, you must use that funding to build a new state-of-the-art ultra-supercritical plant with all the state-of-the-art control technologies on there. With the World Bank withdrawing that offer, countries are going to be going to banks which may not be quite as prescriptive about the new plant to be built. And so there is the possibility of new plants being built which are not state-of-the-art, which are dirty, and which are going to be locked into the coal future for 30, 40, 50 years into the future. Now, this implies that everybody's moving away from coal and divestment is huge. Now, as Mo said in his webinar last month, that's not the case. It's a change of where the money's coming from and how much is coming from each of the different regions. And at the moment, a lot of the investment is coming out of China. I'm not going to talk much about this slide because I say Mo did it beautifully last month. So I suggest if you're interested in this, when you finish listening to me, click on to Mo's webinar and do a catch up on that. Investment is out there for coal. It's difficult to quantify where it's coming from, but it's still happening. And so unsurprisingly, coal is still happening. This graph is not a comparison, as you might think, of where coal is at the moment and what has been built. This is plants simply under construction and planned into the future. So what we can see here that unsurprisingly China, India and the Southeast nations are investing heavily in new coal plant with a lot under construction and even more so planned. What I hasten to add at this point is that the new built in China is largely ultra-supercritical advanced systems with these ultra-low emission strategies on them. So they are state-of-the-art coal plants that are going in there. So how can emissions from coal be reduced? We're going to come back to focusing on mercury, and as such, we need to focus on the Minamata Convention because this is the convention that's going to cause countries around the world which don't currently have mercury control strategies to move into adopting emissions control for mercury. And as of last Monday when I checked, there are 113 parties which are working towards the Minamata Convention. Article 8 relates to the emissions from stationary sources, and under that it lists the sources of concern. So we're talking about coal-fired power plants and boilers, smelting processes, non-ferrous metals, waste incineration, cement clinkers, and so on. And what it does, it breaks them down into existing and new sources. For new sources, we're not going to cover today because that basically means best available technology as you see it within your country has to be applied to all new plants. For existing sources, that's the ones that could be effectively expensive for anyone keeping coal in their energy mix. So a ratifying party to Minamata is going to have to put control technologies within 10 years of entering the convention. Now, the convention is not prescriptive to any stretch of the imagination. It is basically a guidance of what can be done with suggestions for approaches. So you can use one of the following 5 approaches. You can use a quantified goal. I will reduce mercury by 50% within the next 10 years. An emission limit value, such as that being adopted in the EU or has been adopted in China and the USA. The use of best available techniques and practices, which combines basically with emission limit values. Usually you're using one to get to the other. Or which may be more relevant for emerging economies, multi-pollutant control strategies. We can't expect new nations that don't have NOx and SOx controls to come in and immediately start working about mercury over anything else. What we want them to do is work towards reducing all emissions simultaneously. And finally, there's what's known as the alternative measures, which basically means anything you can come up with to reduce mercury emissions from your coal fleet. So it's not prescriptive. You can choose any or all of the above and that's the flexibility and perhaps the advantage of the Minamata Convention, is that it's not prescriptive. You do what you have to do to get your emissions down, as long as you promise to get those emissions down. So running quickly through the emissions control options, this is where you probably know me and love me from, these diagrams of mercury control in coal-fired power plants. And basically mercury, if it's elemental, it will pass through that coal-fired power plant untouched. If it's oxidized, it will stick to unburnt carbon and it will solubilize in any wet system it passes, such as a scrubber. And it will attach to any sorbents it passes also. So ideally we want as much of the mercury in the oxidized form as it passes through this plant as we possibly can to get what we call the co-benefit reduction. Now, to some extent, oxidation will happen as a result of temperature and activity in the boiler there. Any halogens that are in the coal will help oxidization, as will SCR, the selective catalytic reduction there for NOx control, can also oxidize mercury and make it nicely sticky and soluble, which means that it will be captured in the fly ash in an ESP, or even better, in a baghouse and in the wet FGD system. There are some re-emission issues with the wet FGD systems, but these can be solved by adding sorbents or oxidants, and oxidants can be added to the coal or into the boiler to oxidize. And in the perfect situation, this works beautifully as it is, and in a standard coal-fired power plant with SOx and NOx control as we see here, you can expect a minimum of 30% mercury control for free, possibly over 90–95%, but it is very plant and site and coal dependent. So what we try to do is work with the systems that are already there to maximize this co-benefit effect by tweaking the way they work through temperature control, through oxidant addition, or by adding sorbents into the mix. There are many things you can do to maximize your mercury control to get it up to and over 95%. Now, a lot of people ask us when they're looking at the Minamata Convention, deciding on how to control emissions, what's going to be the cheapest option for me? And I wish there was an easy answer, but it isn't. It is very plant and situation dependent. It's also location dependent. For example, the cost of activated carbon is going to be very much cheaper in the USA, where it's readily available and there are manufacturers, as opposed to somewhere like India, where perhaps we're not moving into that market yet. And also, it depends very much on your existing plant, whether you have flue gas desulfurization, which you already have a fabric filter. We have to work with what you have. So within the convention, we've tried to divide low costs to high costs options. And surprisingly, to a lot of people, coal washing is actually quite high. Certainly as expensive as a mercury control option, and it creates a whole new waste stream that we have to worry about. Coal blending is cheaper to do, but it depends on your coal availability. Additives can be cheap, and surprisingly, they do not have as many corrosive impacts on the plant as they used to have in the past. You have to use very low quantities of these additives to get the result in many regions, and so corrosion is not as much of an issue as many people think it is. And there are new multi-pollution systems becoming available and coming online too. All this is covered in the best available guidance documents of the Minamata Convention, which are available in the 6 UN languages and available from the website at the UN as one-click downloads. It's quite a meaty document, it's quite technical, and so we've provided the Coal Partnership, the Clean Coal Centre advises too, we've provided this decision tree which helps you work through the options for reducing mercury emissions from coal combustion. So as a plant operator or somebody looking over their coal fleet, you might look down and say, do I have carbon capture and storage? Unless you're boundary down, I'm not one of the other ones. No, you don't. Do I have SCR? Yes or no? You follow that flow sheet down with your finger, basically, and it will tell you potentially the best option for mercury control in your certain situations. Now, we don't propose for any minute that this should be done as a utility, as a plant manager, as a prescriptive means to deciding what to do with your plant. But it is a good way of tuning down and focusing in the sections of the best available technology guidance document that are appropriate to you. What makes it even easier, is the IPOG, the Interactive Process Optimization Guidance tool that we provide free of charge through the Coal Partnership and also through the IEA Clean Coal Centre. And it's a little tool that's there to let you predict the mercury emissions from your plant on a plant-by-plant basis. It's this little interface. It's a little exe file that your computer won't want to download because it's an exe file, but it's really good fun. It has packed back behind that simple front screen, there is thousands of data from the information collection request in America. Every single plant had to provide information on mercury in the coal and the balance through the plant where it came out in the ash or in the stack, as well as the oxidation state. So all the plants in America gave that information. We've also supplemented that with information from studies in China, India, South Africa, Thailand, Indonesia, and Russia. So there's a lot of plant information in there. And while it might look quite complicated, it's not. You just click on each of these individual tabs there and you type in any information you have. If you don't, you can choose a standard coal blend or a single coal, such as a high sulfur, low bituminous coal. You just type in what you want and it will, click by click, build an image of your plant and predict your mercury emissions. So for this particular plant that I've put in, it's a basic coal, I think it's a subbituminous coal, and going into a standard boiler, with passing through an SCR system, which will be oxidizing the mercury, passing through an ESP system, a cold side one, and through an FGD. And what is predicting at the end there is that I'm getting 82.2% mercury control at that plant, which is what we would hope for through co-benefit effects. However, if I'm a plant manager in America, I may see that as not being enough. I may need to be getting below that. I might need to be getting 95% mercury control to meet my emission standards. So what I can do without leaving my desk is to go back and say, okay, I can try blending my coals. I could try adding activated carbon or throwing in some oxygen. And you can do that with this program. Click calculate, and in under a second, it will tell you how effective that control strategy would be. We find this extremely useful when we're taking the coal partnership information around the world to emerging regions to show them how simple it is to control mercury emissions through balance of plants changes, but also to let them play with their own data privately if they choose to do so that they can get a better feel for what they could achieve and what they can afford to do. And not just even the co-benefit effects. I mean, obviously that's the lowest cost options. There are a lot of emerging technologies out there which I reviewed in a recent report. Just Google mercury control and you will hit all the acronyms in the world and all these new technologies. And the reason why these technologies are still being developed is because people are determined to get to that 100% mercury control. We're almost there, but we need to be there. And so mercury control is going to be needed for decades to come, as I've shown, because coal is with us for decades to come. And just to prove that it is effective in practice, this is the data from the US in the wake of the mercury and air toxics rule and the ICR, when all the original mercury control options and controls came in. And what we can see, this is for mercury, elemental mercury and oxidized mercury, is that the co-benefit effects have been significant. So the co-benefit effects for SOx control, not so good for elemental mercury because it's not soluble, but huge for oxidized mercury. For SCR, because that's where elemental mercury is being oxidized, it's a significantly effective for oxidized mercury control. So when you add these two together, what we're seeing is, as I've said, the potential for 95% reduction by using existing mercury control systems with that little bit of mercury activated carbon, taking it and guaranteeing it over the 95% for mercury. So let's quickly end up by looking at industry. It's something we've not really covered at the Clean Coal Centre. We do tend to focus on the larger utilities, but mercury, of course, comes from anywhere that you're burning coal. So coal is intrinsic to some processes, such as cement and steel production. Here we see ferrous metal production, that's steel. What I'm saying is that because coal is going in there, it's coming out. The mercury is behaving exactly the same way it would in a coal-fired power plant. So we're seeing oxidized and elemental forms, and we're seeing that potentially being captured in the fly ash or the gypsum or going out of the stack. It's all controllable in the same way. The issue with industry is that it's an economy of scale. A lot of these processes are smaller and perhaps coming under the radar for some legislation. But of course, it can be done and it should be done. Cement manufacture, again, something we've not really covered, a major source of CO2 emissions, never mind mercury emissions. And the mercury is coming in through raw materials and fuels, including the coal. Again, sorbents, co-benefit effects for NOx and SOx control can work. There is an issue with dust shuttling. It's a lot of moving solid material around in a cement plant, and that can lead to a build-up and a concentration of mercury in a solid form, which is not good because you can lead to re-emission issues. And this is dealt with in this excellent article that I've referenced down here that I suggest you go and see if you want to know more about cement manufacture and the potential for mercury control. It's all doable. It's the economy of scale. And these are data from China when we're looking at different metal production. So this is the non-ferrous metal. And what we see again there is the air pollution control devices, is the APCDs and acid options. These are using technologies, co-benefit effects, or putting in new technologies for acid gas removal, scrubbing, or particulate control. And what we're saying is that mercury control in these systems can be up to and over 90, 95, 98%. Same as in a coal-fired power plant. If you do it properly, it can be done. And what we see here for this graph in China is the application of this is increasing on these non-ferrous metal sources to the extent that over in the bottom right there, the emissions from several years ago have been cut by several orders of magnitude. It's achievable and it's doable. It just needs to be applied on a more global scale. So can't we just phase out these industries? Well, yes and no. Because steel requires carbon in there, you're going to have to put coal in there. And so there are a lot of industries, including steel, which require coal until somebody comes up with a better way of producing something, that material, or something equivalent to that material. And this is the ECOFIS World Wildlife prediction for taking coal out of the energy mix by 2050. So this is not what's going to happen. This is kind of best case scenario. This is an optimistic prediction for getting rid of coal by 2050 using aggressive end-use energy savings in electrification and by substituting almost everything with renewable sources. And even under that, the most optimistic scenario ever, fossil fuels will not be completely gone by 2050 because there are some instances where they currently simply cannot be replaced. There's also the locked-in effect. Even if we stop building coal-fired power plants and industry right now, unless somebody comes up with an alternative, they're going to keep running until they're not needed anymore. And so the lifetime, as I said, of a coal-fired power plant can be up to and over 40 or 50 years. For iron and steel manufacturers and cement kilns, you're talking about maybe 20, 30 years. These are challenges that we're going to face even if we stop using coal now, even if we stop building any more coal plants and stop using coal in industry. We have a legacy of coal issues and emissions to deal with, and that's why we have to continue to look at emission control strategies in the long term. So to conclude, coal is going to remain part of the energy mix as it's reliable and affordable, and it's currently there. And even if we don't build anything new starting now, we have a legacy that must be dealt with responsibly. There are new technologies that have been covered in a lot of recent reports from the Clean Coal Centre, which show that mercury control can be achieved by 95% or more, and new systems are coming online daily to get that down to zero or near zero. And there's also the new coal systems, the new gasifications, the fuel cells, the alum cycle that we covered in recent reports as well, that offer the ultra clean, if not zero emission option for coal that we're all working towards. If you want to hear me talk about mercury and other pollutant emissions from coal, or other people preferably, then please do come and join us in Hanoi in Vietnam, where we will have Vietnamese utilities recommended, hopefully the government, sponsors, papers that are on there. Check out the website. It's online. The preliminary agenda is available online, and you can register and book now. It's in a beautiful location, and it's going to be a very interesting event. It is filling up. We do have a maximum capacity of 70-75 people, so if you are interested in coming, I do recommend that you register as soon as you possibly can. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know if I can tune in to hear questions, but I will give it a try. Okay, there are no questions as far as I can see right now, which means I've covered this perfectly and told you everything you needed to know. I don't believe for a minute that's the case. And that is why my email is on the bottom of the screen right now. I do reply to all emails. I'm very good at that. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions you have on anything I've talked about today. Thank you once again for having Coal with Your Coffee, and do tune in next month for the next webinar. Thank you.